So good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to our Activity and Robert Half Collaboration Forum. This is week 5 of our 2021 series, and it's great to be back to collaborate with you all this week and be inspired by you all once again. My name's Paul Middleton. I'm a Managing Director in Protivity, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues from Protivity, as well as by my colleagues from our sister company, Robert Half. Since January and until the end of March, we are bringing you another terrific series of debates on a range of topics that will invigorate, challenge and inspire us all, and that are designed to bring us optimism in these tough times. For those of you new to the forums, we started these back in March last year with the intention of creating a regular forum for business leaders where, in the face of the challenges, the disruptions and the uncertainties you faced, you could talk to each other, learn from each other, challenge each other and gain confidence from each other's perspectives. 10 months have passed and the challenges, the disruptions, the uncertainties remain and are arguably even greater now. With continued lockdown, new COVID variants, the effects of Brexit, political turmoil and the gloom of a lockdown winter, it's easy to lose perspective. So in this, our 4th series, we wanted to bring you renewed perspective, fresh insight, and a healthy dose of optimism and confidence, as we believe that within this adversity, with collaboration and the right mindset, lies opportunity for us all. To unlock this optimism and opportunity, we need to be bold and we need to be different. A common thread that's run through all of our forums and that has been a rallying cry for us at Protivity and Robert Half alike is that now is the time to think differently and to be actioning both those big and those small ideas. Put differently, if we don't drive change during this current period of disruption, we run the risk of rapidly becoming irrelevant. So to help you do this, we are bringing you new speakers and new inspirators every week to kickstart a debate. In the following weeks, we have Paralympians, CEOs, innovators, disruptors, entrepreneurs, and many others who are driving inspiring visions and positive change. Next week, we have Paralympian cyclist and gold medalist Neil Fashy to talk about achieving your potential in your personal life and your work life, winning mindsets and taking advantage of the opportunities presented to you. All of these great panelists will share perspectives that you can react to. And react is what we want you to do in this forum. This isn't a closed forum. You're not permanently muted or expected to be a silent participant. This is deliberately a collaboration forum. We want to hear your voice and we want you to be part of the debate in the true spirit of collaboration. To get involved, you can raise your hand using the Teams button in the top right hand corner and I'll come to you. You can write your thoughts in the chat, or if you just can't contain yourself, you can shout out and let us know your thoughts. You might just have to take yourself off mute to do that, but please let us know what you have to say and get involved because it's infectious. So without further ado this week, I'm delighted to introduce you to our lead inspirator, Dr. Elizabeth Kilbey. Elizabeth is a consultant clinical psychologist who has spent the last 18 years working with children, adults and families, both within the NHS and privately. She has 4 degrees, including a Master's in Child Development, and is studying for another one at the moment. You may recognise Elizabeth as a resident expert on the Channel 4 series, The Secret Life of 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and also maybe from her book, Unplugged Parenting. We're very excited to have Elizabeth with us today during half term, when I think some of you may be breathing a sigh of relief from homeschooling, while others of you may be taking a break. But that break is going to be different. You're not probably spending it with your family, your friends, and you're probably lacking the enrichment of social interaction. So we wanted to dig into that, understand how we can remain positive as individuals as well as households and families, understand the impact of lockdown on those around us, especially children, and explore the impact of digital and social media, not just on our children, but also with the Generation Z coming through, who we might be looking to hire into our businesses, as well as explore the importance of embracing neurodiversity and broader diversity topics within the workplace. So, a huge amount to cover in an hour. And so, Elizabeth, I'd like to get going and maybe start by asking you just to ground us in some facts. We've got a lot of business people here today who may not be too sure what a clinical psychologist is and may even be a little bit scared by that term. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what being a clinical psychologist means and its application to both personal and business life?
I certainly can. Good morning, everyone. Paul, can I just start by saying awesome intro? And I have to say, I have been warned that Paul's special skill is that he can segue even the most wayward speaker back onto topic. Not that I'm taking that as a challenge this morning. And I was listening keenly to your intro thinking, blimey, this is a big build up. And the bit that really made me laugh is that if we don't adapt, we're going to become irrelevant. I work with teenagers. I'm reminded daily how irrelevant I am. So it's very nice to talk to a group of adults who might not think that. And I did want to say to people, there's lots of little icons on my screen. If you want to turn your cameras on, even if you're sat in your pajamas eating toast, that would be lovely, because then I've got humans to talk to. So what's a clinical psychologist? I think you're right that it daunts people a bit. I've been known to say at various social gatherings that I'm an aerobics instructor, just because it's an absolute conversation killer to tell people you're a psychologist. The consultant bit means I've been doing it for ages. So I qualified in 2004, so that's kind of a long career in NHS terms. And psychologist bit means that I've done training in what I call the science of the mind. My children frequently remind me psychology is not a proper science. But we psychologists consider ourselves scientists. So it's the study of the individual and how the individual interacts with things around them, as opposed to sociology, which is much more group focused. So I suppose my interest is in people and how they work. And the clinical bit means, in its purest sense, problems. So you have different brands of psychology. So you might have forensic psychology for prisons, educational psychology for schools, and clinical psychology is the sort of everything else. Typically associated with mental health problems, but my bit is more about development, how children develop, the way that people think that might be different. And I work across my own private practice with individuals, but also into a lot of schools. And I do a lot of consulting to schools and groups to help them support people to perform to the best of their ability.
So thank you, Elizabeth. So you were the resident psychologist on Channel 4 Secret Life of 4, 5, 6-year-olds. And many of our guests joining today in the chaos of half term are not necessarily relishing that return to homeschooling next week. What are the key learnings when you've worked in that environment? What are the key learnings from that? And I guess maybe broaden your career about how you help a household at this time stay cohesive, keep positive, have purpose, and how do people get the most out of these really strange times?
I mean, they are really strange times. I mean, yes, one of the most fun jobs I've had was working on Secret Lives. It was incredibly hard. I mean, it was super long days. We would sit for the whole duration of the time that the children were in the nursery, and we had 27 camera rigs set up, so we really could watch them everywhere. And we had mic links to every one of the children. So it was slightly mind warping, because we could hear 12 different voices at any given time into our headsets. And if one of them suddenly screamed, it was a slightly deafening experience. You had to preempt somebody about to scream. But the first thing, it was just completely immersive. It was that from the minute they arrived to the minute they left, you were with them, which was amazing, because you get that, nobody really watches children for that long. So there was that sense of the sort of totality of their experience. But also it was that kind of David Attenborough sort of hiding behind the bushes kind of watching that you don't ever get to do in real life, because it would be weird. So it was that kind of opportunity to see something with the minimum impact on what you're observing, because I go into schools and I go into children's homes, and I'm not inconspicuous. It's blindingly obvious that I'm there. Even if I sort of creep along the back wall of the classroom, someone's going to spot me. Invariably, they know who I'm there to see. So the children will go, "Hi, miss, he's over there." So there's nothing kind of subtle about the approach. So the chance to observe without your observation status being so obvious was so powerful, because you just got to see children in all of their kind of natural way. And I learned that children are amazingly resilient. I learned that they're hilarious. I mean, they are so funny. And I learned that that growing up, that developing is a job that has to be done in its own right. And a child is not a small adult. I mean, that's kind of super important. The brain is going through different stages and phases, and it's got work to do. And one of the really important things that we need to do is get out of the way. Children kind of know what they've got to do. They need to move and jump and talk and interact and laugh and explore and fail and fall over. And they need to do all of that. And our job as parents is to kind of set the environment up to allow them to do that, not too constraining, not too risk averse, but put them in a place where they can crack on with what they need to do, kind of stay out of the way, be there if they need us. So that was the kind of most amazing bit of doing Secret Lives. And on the whole, when the world is normal, we can do that, but we are not living in the new normal, and it hasn't been very normal for a long time. And I suppose, when we first went into lockdown, the world went very strange. We all went into this kind of instant coping mode. Adults are really good at that, and we set sort of parameters for children. This is what we're going to do now. I think what's been so challenging is, for us, it's been a year, which is a reasonably long time for a grown-up. It's an unbelievably long time for a child. For a 10-year-old, that's a tenth of their life. That's a pretty massive chunk. And now they can't remember what life was like before. This is the new normal, and it's really, really strange. So I think what we're trying to do now is to help them understand that this is time limited, that we are segueing back into something more familiar for them, and help them make sense of this experience, really, all the time that we are also living with this uncertainty. It's really challenging.
It is, but that's fascinating. I'd like to move on to talk about the impact that then, particularly you've seen of lockdown on children and families. Before we do, once again, I'd just like to bring in one of our own fertility consultants, Jordan. I know you've looked at this and you've got some thoughts to share, and Elizabeth, you can then react to those and share your own thoughts there. But Jordan, would you be kind enough just to share your thoughts?
Good morning, Paul. Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. I wanted to just bring 3 discussion points, I suppose, almost following on what Elizabeth has said, looking at the impact of lockdown on family and children. So 3 main topics I just wanted to bring to the table today was looking almost how groups are disproportionately affected, worries about financial security, the home life and the future, and I suppose lastly looking at concerns over education delivery. Looking at groups that are disproportionately affected, I suppose has brought light to the fact that some are more vulnerable than others, which almost links to how are we going to account for different demographics and accounting for how we're going to support family and children in those different demographics. I mean, it's been noted that a higher proportion of young people in poverty stated that they were more anxious and concerned about coronavirus than those that are not. Following on to worries about financial security, the home life and the future. There's been certain concern from parents over the future of jobs and the security of them. Research in the UK has indicated that half of the parents anticipate that coronavirus will harm their children's happiness in the years to come. So I suppose that brings me on to the next point of understanding that, well, home life for children is completely different. And an added dynamic that's been brought into the mix is special educational needs being added as an extra stress to some parents. Lastly, looking at concerns over the education delivery. Worries about education and anxiety for students is at an all-time high, and some kids have noted that they are concerned about the future career opportunities and certainly the virtual workings impact on that. Looking at, I suppose, some demographics and limited digital access, and some home working environments for children are not conducive, and how do we account for that? So I suppose lastly, looking at almost when we move into this new normal, there needs to be clear communication from schools and public health officials to ensure some certainty for children and to give them some sort of certainty moving forwards. And when we do move back into the new normal, I suppose it's validating those experiences amongst different children, because each person's experience over the last year would have been different. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Jordan. There's a lot of material there, and there's a lot of talking points. And Elizabeth, maybe I should come back to you and we'll maybe come on to digital media in a moment. But what have you seen the particular impact on children, I guess maybe families during lockdown? And what kind of pillars or advice would you have for everyone here as kind of think of it through this lens and and try and create that cohesiveness, that positivity by doing this? What would that be?
I mean, big question, Paul. I mean, I think what I've learned from working with families for such a long time is that children need stability, they need consistency, but they really need containment. Being a child is a pretty carefree experience if your external reality is stable, if you feel heard and understood, and you know that there's a roof over your head and that there's food coming and that the general world around you is pretty okay. You can actually switch off from that reality quite a lot and just get on with being a child. However, children are very astute and aware. They are not separate from their environments. And so what impacts adults impacts children. And it, you know, the coronavirus has impacted adults. I always think that children are these kind of wash of feelings. If you think of feelings as this kind of sea of water, and as a parent, sometimes your job is just to be that really massive bucket that kind of holds that swell of water. And sometimes your job is just to stand still. You know, if you stand still, the water level will settle, and you have to be this strong-sided bucket to kind of weather this storm. If you yourself are being bombarded by a reality that's hugely stressful, you're just, you know, you just don't have as much resource to do that job. And so it's really hard for parents at the moment. So parents getting as much support as they can to help them feel like the world is as safe as it can be is often the most helpful thing that they can do to settle their children and to manage the environment. So often it's, you know, knowing that your child is distressed is then an added stressor for you. Nobody wants to be in that position. But actually, what practical steps can you take? What resources are available? How can you reach out to make sure that you can keep things as predictable as you can? And that is probably at the moment the most helpful thing we can do for children.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like now just to move on to digital media and children. And as I mentioned at the top, this isn't all about children per se, because as we bring this back to business, what we'll then begin to look at is how I think the generations are changing and how actually the people that we're beginning to employ are that Generation Z, that Generation Z, and actually the minds are wired differently and we need to be adapting to that. But maybe if we can just start off by talking a little bit about children and digital media, because I know that's been a big research area for you, a topic you talked on TED Talks and television programs. Can you give us your views about the growing influence of social media and digital media in children's lives? I guess the benefits and the challenges, and in practical terms, again, what's your advice to everyone here today around that before we move on to more of the business angle?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge passion of mine, and I would like to put in a little bit of sort of neuroscience here, because I think understanding how children's brains work is kind of super important. You know, I have gone on the record saying, actually, I take quite a moderate stance to not just social media, but tech, screen time, not because I'm kind of puritanical, but for small children. As I said, they've got this developmental journey to go to. They've got motor skills and language skills and social skills. And actually, that's quite a lot to pack into a day. And my concern, as I've kind of said before about screen time, is that it's just the thing that gets in the way of doing that. You know, children who have higher levels of screen time have higher associated levels of obesity, not because screens make you fat, but they mean you don't move. So, you know, it's the competition, it's the competing with your developmental trajectory that concerns me somewhat about screen time and younger children. Now, I'm also completely aware that I am ironically saying that in the current climate where we are putting children in front of screens for 6 to 8 hours a day in lieu of education. So kind of, you know, what does this mean for all of our really good science that we had before, where we said, well, screens, you know, you know, I always make the analogy with parents between screen time and sugar. You know, would you give your children unregulated access to sugar, free reign, without having a conversation about the health implications of that for them? Probably not. So in the past, I've always had a stance of screens have got a place in your child's life. You know, that they develop a particular skill set. They can be a really good opportunity for socializing when you can't get out and physically socialize. But you should have a plan. You should have rules. You should have limits, a bit like you would for everything else. Getting them on and getting them off seem to be kind of charge points. But that for me is about younger children, you know, up to the kind of moving into senior school age. I think once you get into secondary school, you're in a slightly different territory. You know, social media becomes and screen time and gaming become part of the adolescent experience. It's an extension of how they define themselves as a group, how they express their interests, how they connect to each other. So if I could just indulge you in a moment of kind of sort of neuroscience, really, which I think is really important. So up to age 5, the brain's job is to grow prolifically. So it's making endless pathways with no limits. And when children get to about age 4 to 5, there's a kind of system reboot where the brain says we are running out of space. We're going to have to start pruning some of these pathways, a bit like a tree. And what happens is you start pruning and reusing the pathways that you're going to need, and those are the ones that get strengthened, which is a kind of neat fit for school. Then you have latency, which is the next bit until about age 12 or 13. Latency is a bit dormant. It's a bit like winter. It's nice and quiet. There's lots going on under the ground. Usually not too conflict driven. They're quite moralistic at this age, strong sense of right and wrong, bit obsessional. That's what all those Yu-Gi-Oh cards and Pokemon stuff's all about, playground crazes. So in that phase, you can have lots of nice rules around social media and you can really sort of negotiate and manage it. The trouble is what's coming next. What's coming is adolescence, which is like the storm, really. And you need latency as kind of money in the bank to build that emotional connection, because adolescence is going to test that. And that's the point of it. Because two important things about adolescence. One is that it's another period of brain rebooting. So your frontal lobes, front sections of the brain, are going to come online. Frontal lobes are all the good stuff: organisation, sequencing, planning, risk management, delayed gratification, the stuff that we really like as adults. So when you're getting your frontal lobes online, the brain needs to drill in, make synaptic connections, because the frontal lobes really have been quite quiet up until now. In order to do that, the brain has to conserve energy. So it powers down to, I like this, non-essential functions. So it powers down language and motor control, which is why teenagers lie down and grunt at you. It's why they're monosyllabic, because they're preserving kind of energy. So that whole Kevin and Perry thing is like totally a thing. That's what they do. So there's all of that brain reboot going on. So bits are offline, it's not working brilliantly. That's why teenagers seem so profoundly illogical. And the second thing that adolescence does is it's the developmental journey out of your family. Because if you think about it, being at home is quite nice. Everything's on tap. You're going to have to move into the adult world. My children tell me all the time that adulting doesn't seem that fun. They are correct, it's not. So, you know, how are you going to get out from the nest? I mean, why would you go? So what happens is you over-identify with the peer group. So you kind of start to denigrate the nuclear family. You guys are rubbish, you don't know anything. Over-identify with your peers, because you're going out to start your own nuclear family. So being gross to your family creates a push. You know, I'm not putting up with this anymore. And over-identifying with your peers creates a pull. These guys are super cool. And it's the pathway out. So social media has a function in this. It's supposed to alienate you from your family because you're trying to leave, and it's supposed to connect you to your peers. So your job as a parent is to kind of ride out that storm of revoltingness whilst keeping just connected enough for safety, for oversight. You've got to kind of walk that tightrope of hanging onto them too hard and shoving them out. And social media is the sort of, I don't know, the sort of glue that binds all of that hot mess going on at home. And I think I would say to parents in this current day and age, you've got to keep an eye on it. I mean, it was on the news last night. I can't even pronounce it. Omegle, a completely terrifying social. It's been around for a long time, but all of these things exist in a way that our generation is not supposed to know about, because it's meant to be part of the subculture. So they're constantly evolving to be this thing that you can't keep up with. They change the language, they change the dialogue, because it's meant to keep the uncool generation out. So your job is to swim against that as parents, really, which, as all of us know, is a pretty grim job.
Thank you so much for that. There is, Elizabeth, in that, if I may just prod on that slightly, there is, however, this new tension in lockdown where actually social media, electronic devices are not now just a nice to have and something that can be time boxed. Actually, our children are living them every day. How do you reconcile that, where it's just moved into actually, 8 hours a day they can be sat in front of a screen learning?
Absolutely. And I think this is an absolutely valid challenge, because we've all, experts have been spouting endlessly about moderation and, time and a place. And now tech is the new school. I mean, and we don't know what the impact of this is going to be. We don't know what 6 hours a day at a screen is going to be. We don't know what future education is going to look like. There's a part of me that hopes proving that education can be delivered virtually will help some of the children that I work with that have struggled profoundly being in school. And I think the majority of the children that I see want to go back to school. This isn't the new school. This hasn't killed school. They want to go back and see each other. But it certainly has, I think, made parents recalibrate. And what I'm concerned about is when the new normal comes back, that the levels of tech and screen time that we've seen, people have acclimatized to. So this is what we do now. And there's no sense, we sort of go up a gate level. This is now, tech 6 hours a day is what we do. So that does really worry me, because I don't think we know what that's going to do or be like for children's development.
Okay. Just reflecting on that, and I know that there's a lot of crystal ball gazing here, but I'm just going to try and bring in some of the questions that have come through. And as ever, please put your hand up or shout out if I'm not fairly representing you here, or if you want to say something else on it. A few comments around lockdown anxiety, and how that's obviously occurred during lockdown. How do you think that will affect children after the pandemic? Is the first one coming through?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, children are anxious because the world feels unsafe, and the impact of lockdown has been so, the virus has had such a profound impact on the whole world, including adults, and children rely on the fact that adults can manage everything and keep the world safe. So the reality that they haven't been able to do that, there was something bigger than parental control, is truly terrifying for children. So our ability to return to normal, our ability to make things look as they used to look, will be very reassuring and settling for them. But they have lived through an experience of Armageddon for them, and how can we expect them not to have? It sort of rocked their faith in the stability of the world.
Thank you. And so, yeah, I don't think anyone here will disagree with that. But I think that view of the world, however, is often a reflection or an extension of the parents. And I think, you mentioned to it before. So is that anxiety they're going to see a reflection or extension of the parents? And, you use the analogy of a big bucket swilling around. To what extent is that just passed on to the children?
Absolutely. One of our toughest jobs as parents is to try and maintain that stability and normal, that facade. I say to parents a lot, fake it until you can make it. Even if you're not feeling it, you've got to put that mask on, you've got to get into that role. I often say to parents, sometimes manage your children like you would an employee at work, calm and dispassionate and slightly arm's length, because if you let the emotions get into this, it's really gonna muddy the waters. But in terms of what this Armageddon means to children, we can show them that actually difficult things do happen, but we can't prevent that. But what we can do is manage the recovery. So actually, adults have skills and resources. Look at what the world has done to mobilize a response. Look at how we're going to turn things around. It's the getting back to normal. It's the recovery, demonstrating to children that we don't have total control over the planet, but we have control about how we respond. And that is the most important lesson we teach children. You can't prevent disaster, but you can choose how you respond to it. Thank you.
And it's great to see there's a lot of reaction coming in around screen time. And I think just one of the ones I'll highlight is that I think Lindsay's highlighted that Anne Lewfield, the Children Commissioner, has said that I think when we the court of public opinion in a few years' time, it looks back, will say, our current exposure or the current exposure of children to social media will be deemed a disgrace in a few years' time. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I am concerned about it. I'm definitely, and I know that I'm at odds with some of my sort of peers who say that it's the future and it's the way and it's in the workplace and it's how the job market's developing. I don't disagree for adults. I have my concerns about what this level of kind of tech and social exposure does to children, and I'm concerned about their vulnerability. It's interesting to me that parental perception now is that the physical world is unsafe, but the virtual world is safe. Put them in the living room with an iPad, I know where they are, they're perfectly safe. My view is you absolutely no idea where they are, and they might not be safe. And that's the bit that really kind of concerns me, because you can actually watch them when they're outside climbing a tree. You can't stand over them and watch what they're doing, and that's the bit that concerns me. It's the difficulty for you to exercise your normal parental responsibilities when they're doing something that you really can't watch all of the time.
Thank you. I thought I saw a hand up, but I can't see what I meant. So I'd like to just slightly change track then, because it's interesting. Again, we see points coming through in the chat, which you probably haven't had a chance to see about. Are we overstating the potential impact on children, adults of this change in lifestyle? And this is what I'd like to move on to, because I think our children are exposed to things that we weren't exposed, or a number of us here weren't exposed to during our childhood. So is this going to mean that as employers, when we're looking to hire the Generation Z coming through, we need to be looking at this in a different way? Like, what are we going to need to be looking at? Different skill sets, different attitudes towards that, adapting our expectations, and also how we brand ourselves towards those people coming through?
Undoubtedly. And I think taking a sort of longitudinal view on this, I think it's really fascinating, because I would say my generation is different to my parents and to my grandparents. Every generation that comes through is different. And if you think about the purpose of adolescence is to to make yourself in some way different to the generation above, then every adolescent young cohort is reinventing themselves in some different way. Mods and rockers, punks, the sexual revolution, the swinging 60s. It is as old as time. It's no different. The process itself is no different, but the manifestation of how it presents is different. And I think in some ways we're almost moving through that cycle quicker as the world speeds up, and we talk about the different the millennials, the Gen Zs. I've lost track of what group I'm in, but I know it's not cool. So absolutely, we need to adapt to what the generations are saying is important and valuable to them, because that's the cohort that are coming through, and they are a very cohesive group, and they are the in group and we are the out group, and somehow we've got to reconcile that gap.
But do you see, from the exposure to social media and digital, and I guess more screen time, and there's a few questions here saying kind of what's the right level of screen time? How is that brain going to then be working differently? So, is there then a different type of person we're bringing into our organisation that we need to adapt towards?
I mean, there's lots of research around does screen time cause brain changes? Does it cause things? Does it cause ADHD? Does it result in sort of different need for greater immediacy, difficulty waiting, problems with delayed gratification? What we know is that things like gaming and use of tech increase the skills that are required for that task. So reaction times increase, visual tracking improves, because the brain adapts to do what it needs to do. The evidence on whether increased screen time reduces social interaction skills or social skills per se, the jury's out on that. There's not a strong evidence base for that. But I would say, because the brain develops what it needs to do, if you want to have strong social interaction skills, interact with real life people, because the totality of feedback is better on digital media. You're speaking to people. Texting is a very different communication medium to verbal. You haven't got any of the voice or the intonation or the emphasis, all of the things that you need. So I think we're breeding a generation of people who communicate differently, who have different communication expectations, written word versus spoken word. My children are of a generation that don't ring anybody. They said the only people we'd phone would be someone over 30, Mum. Nobody under 30 picks up a phone. We would like message each other, and I'm like, is this not inefficient? Like, come on. So yeah, are we breeding a generation who reach out? They'll be having 3 conversations through different platforms, Instagram, Snapchat, and I'm like, this is like overload. Is this not confusing? No. So we're having different expectations of a cohort about how they relate and communicate. It works amongst them. It doesn't work with us. It's crossing the generational bridge. For me, is because the cohort will decide its environment. If you have a whole company made up of individuals of the same way of thinking, that's how they operate, because that's what they think. It's the sort of stratification of the different layers of an organization, in my experience, that struggle to relate to each other.
So we're not looking at an office environment in 10 years' time, when we are back in the office, of people just sat there with their headphones on texting each other, but more maybe a generation of multitaskers who can actually maybe kind of take on more at the same time. Maybe
they might all be sat there texting each other terrifyingly. Absolutely. I'm going to confess, Paul, I've come into my house before and text my children to find out where they are because I'm hollering and nobody answers me. we might do. I mean, this is, and that's the really important thing. All of this is up for grabs, and it's not to be determined by us. We are the outgoing model. The incoming model will decide what happens. It's about making that work in the work environment, because arguably the outgoing people are the ones that have kind of got the plan. We are the sort of founder generation, and the new blood coming in. We've got to somehow mesh that old model vision with kind of new model plans and ideas. And that presumably is the tension that every organisation is currently facing.
Okay, thank you. I've just seen a hand go up. Rupert, you struggle to find the mute button. Rupert?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Elizabeth, this is fascinating. Just listening to you, I wonder what your perception would be on how our ability to judge risk has changed as a result of this. So, one of the things I was worried about was how, if we're being kind of told what to do and when to do it and how to do it, when we're kind of put back out into the world, our internal locus of control might have been impacted slightly. And one of the things I think that children do really well is they learn about risk, and they learn the risks they can take. I wonder what your thoughts would be on that, and perhaps maybe for adults as well.
I think that's really interesting, because I think risk is like everything else. It's a behaviour that's modelled. So I think that children from a very early age pick up on what a parent thinks is safe or not. Be careful, you know, hold my hand while you're crossing the road. So all of that time spent with parents is kind of modelling levels of safety. And I think we all know parents who are the sort of parents who say to the child, oh, go up the tree, I'll catch you if they fall, versus the kind of parent that just goes, be careful, be careful. You know, we all have our own sort of levels. And the more time we spend with our children, the more we transmit those messages and ideas. So for me, it's a concern when children and parents aren't doing things together. And that's one of my concerns about tech. It isolates us. We all spend time on our own. But I think there is now a really big difference, because when you said risk, it made me think, do you mean risk in the physical world, like careful, don't fall down the stairs? Or do you mean risk in the other world that children live in, which is the virtual world? And the virtual world is so difficult because you can't see what you're dealing with. You don't know who that person is. You don't know who it is you're communicating with. You know, that there's, you know, I'm reminded of the fact that children's games have an algorithm built into them with an intermittent reinforcement schedule that triggers their dopamine responses at intervals to keep them hooked into the game. Gamers design games with that algorithm built in. Like, as a parent, I'm like, my children are up against an unfair beast. So how can I help them manage risk and make decisions and know what links to follow and what to do when it's not transparent? Whereas the physical world, I think you've got a better shot at this. You can see what you're dealing with.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Your video's turned off for me. I just want to check everyone else can see Elizabeth, but I know but that's good. All right, that's fine. Don't touch anything, Elizabeth. It's all working. Jade, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, I did. I don't think I've nodded through one of these forums so much in all my life going, yep, that's me, that's me, that's me. I think my question is, when you were saying before about, you know, the parents were a bit kind of like, you know, if they fall over, don't worry, you'll get up. My mum was very much like that. And, you know, unless it was hanging off, you were fine and you didn't need a doctor or anything. My question is, if we try and protect them too much and like shield them to the extremes at the moment, which is natural, especially in something that we have no idea how to navigate. You know, we know how to navigate broken bones, cuts, bruises, heartache, that kind of thing. But this, we have no way of navigating. We don't know what we're dealing with. But could we be affecting their sort of natural resiliency building that would happen in the normal world? And you know, could we then end up building a generation that is too soft and not able to deal with hard knocks down the line? You know, I suppose what's the balance? How do we get this right so that we don't have a generation that's too scared to do anything, or you know, take chances or take risks because we've just wrapped them in cotton wool for a year and a half, 2 years, however long this is going to stick with us? Yeah, I suppose that's kind of my question, my concern, really.
I mean, I think that's so spot on, because, you know, as adults, we have different responses and different reactions to the coronavirus. And I think it's been really divisive, because I think it's really split society. You know, there are people who are extremely cautious and there are people who are now quite cavalier, and often that polarizing does happen. So the messages that we're transmitting to children are, you know, the world is safe, don't stand close to people, don't talk to people, don't touch this, cover your face. And that kind of drilling that we are now saying to them, you know, there's an invisible enemy, you can't see it, but you've got to protect yourself against it. And that is really quite, you know, that's quite weighty for a small child to take on. And how do we then turn around and say to the invisible enemy's gone now? Well, how do you know it's invisible? Like, you know, it's safe, it's safe enough, it's not safe, it's quite safe. And it's all, you know, and these are such complex ideas. How are you going to explain that to a relatively small child? So you're absolutely right. All that we can do is model the sort of moderate, reasonable position, you know. And I always say that to parents, you know, parenting is never done best at the extremes. You know, if you're panicking or avoiding something, either way, opposite experiences, get back into the middle. You know, it's kind of, you know, it's safety in the middle ground. And if you find yourself catastrophizing, expecting the worst, really getting your worry out of proportion, that's a clue that you might need to size this down, because we've got to try and persuade children that there is a sort of normal middle position available to us still.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like to move on the debate slightly here, and there's a lot going on, so I don't want to alienate anyone. But and I think this debate could, or this discussion could go on for a long time. But what we're talking about here is, how we adapt to people who, may be thinking differently, people who have different expectations of the workplace that they go into, be it children or the children in a few years' time, and that kind of begins to come into how we, as employers and as colleagues to other people, how we manage neurodiversity in a workplace. And again, Elizabeth, I'd like to just extend the discussion to that as well, because it's an area you've done a lot of research on, and many hiring plans, many policies, many workplaces are still orientated towards hiring and managing neurotypicals, basically the people in front of them that they see mostly. What changes then do you think employers should make to unlock the potential of these people coming through, as well as their neurodivergent colleagues, and maybe just begin to create a more inclusive work environment for those who are neurodivergent?
Absolutely. I feel really passionate about this. So I spend most of my working career working with children and adults with neurodevelopmental difficulties. And just to kind of that covers anything that isn't considered typical. So it's dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, all the manifestations of thinking differently. The first thing I'd say is it is more prevalent than people realise. So autism could be running as high as 2%. In some countries, they're putting prevalence rates at 7%. ADHD is between 3 and 5%. Dyslexia could be as high as 6%. So the first thing to think is that it's not uncommon. There's a significant chunk of your workforce will have these different ways of operating. And the second thing is I get quite kind of exercised about tokenism, this kind of thinking out of the box idea. If we understand neurodiversity as a profoundly different way of thinking, it's different architecture, it's different brain wiring. It's not a typical brain thinking differently. It is a different starting point. If I was to give you the example, look, my analogies are always so out of date because I'm so old now, but often an autistic way of thinking is very detail focused, very precise and very categorized. So think Sherlock Holmes and the Mind Palace. Think old-fashioned pigeonholes, when you used to get notes, right? Whereas a typically developing brain is vague, goes with the theory of gist and coherence. So it's like the old-fashioned telephone board, where they connect you, all the kind of jumbly wires connecting. That is a different starting point. ADHD, big picture, poor at detail specificity. So if your workforce is made up of people that are bringing a different skill set and a different starting point, that's got to bring value to your organisation, but only if you work with the starting point. There's no good trying to make a neurodivergent person think typically. It's not how they work. But that's what neurodiverse people have to do. They have to try and conform and mask, and it's not helping anyone.
Thank you for that. I think that it's interesting, again, just seeing how the topic, I think, resonates. Lots of comments coming through on the chat. And I think I saw earlier we've Robert Nuri, and I know you had video problems and maybe phone problems, but I don't know if you're on, Robert. No, maybe not. So Robert's the CEO from a company called Arctic Shores that actually looks at this quite deeply.
I am, Paul. Sorry. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So I was just saying, Robert, you're the CEO of Arctic Shores, which uses, for those of you who aren't familiar, uses behavioral technology, AI, and game technology to help organizations make better people decisions and people to make better career decisions and job decisions. What are your thoughts around this, Robert? Because I'm sure this is something that cuts across, where you're looking at trying to manage how, employers look at conscious bias, unconscious bias, and basically create those work environments for people where you can have the blend of skill sets.
Absolutely, thanks. I mean, I found the discussion absolutely fascinating, like many people here so far. And as a parent of two kids who've largely gone out of the nest, as it were, now, I've very much lived through a lot of the things that Elizabeth has been talking about, and very conscious now of how, what that means in terms of these people, these kids then trying to find jobs, and our responsibility as employers to give them the fairest chance to find the right roles. but also to help them in their discovery of what they're good at. And I think the really interesting thing about the neurodiverse discussion now is really a reflection for us as employers. How are we really looking at our recruitment processes to really thoroughly review them as to whether they are objective, whether, I think there are two things for us to be focused on. One, are they objective? Are they really allowing people from the whole spectrum of neurodiversity to shine and demonstrate what they're capable of? Or are we putting barriers in that means that certain groups of society are either restricted or put off from the way that we discover what they've got and what they're capable of? And secondly, we don't give any feedback. And you've seen a lot, I think the BBC's been covering it. There was one poor lad who'd applied for 200 jobs last week and was increasingly looking for jobs that just weren't suited to him because he was just getting desperate. And I think that's an important part of this too, is how do we give feedback to this generation? And we've just been talking about all the challenges that the COVID affected generation are going to go through. When they come to being ready to apply for work, how do we support them in finding out, well, what are their strengths? And then secondly, how as employers are we thinking about how do we see more in people and get rid of gut feel, really try and tackle unconscious bias, but not just unconscious bias in the interviews, but actually in the whole process, the way that we identify talent. Because unless we're tackling those two things, we're just going to make it the challenges that we've been talking about here are just going to accelerate when these people are then starting to apply for work, and then could get very disillusioned very quickly, not because they're not capable, but just because we haven't adapted our recruitment processes to reflect a much more objective and fairer way of identifying talent.
Thank you, Robert. That's fascinating. And I wonder, Elizabeth, if you're able to come back on that. I mean, what are your views around then how we avoid hiring in our own image?
Well, I mean, for me, it's a lot about education. It's about helping people understand what neurodiversity is, and the contribution and the value that it can bring to the workplace. Because I think people are inherently fearful of things that look different. Is this going to be problematic? What's it going to mean for me as an employer? How is this person going to work within the team? Is it, unfortunately, in the commercial world, money speaks. Is this going to cost me more as an employer? Am I going to have to make adaptations? And people become very worried about that. I often write reports for people that talk about the kind of adaptations they might need at work, and employers are very worried about what I'm going to say. And I say things like, can they just have more regular meetings with their managers? Can things be written down instead of spoken? It's nothing. I think people are very fearful, the Equality Act, and we have to make reasonable adjustments. And what is all of this going to mean? Actually, it doesn't mean anything complex at all. Often it means ask the individual what they would require, have a conversation about how that can be adapted into their role. So I think, and we're talking a lot about this generation coming through. Now, this generation coming through are much more neurodiverse literate. They talk about their differences, they access the internet, they communicate, they have much more language around mental health. All of these differences are celebrated in a way that perhaps for the older generation was seen as quite stigmatized, quite shameful, quite hidden. So actually you're engaging with a generation that have a completely different attitude to individual difference, the breadth of skill set, and aren't deterred by these things, and are quite open and vocal. I'm going to give you an example, Paul. I'm mentoring a young person who had an interview for university yesterday, and in their interview, the interviewer said, "Do you have anything to say?" And they said, "Yes, I have dyslexia, so I'm really interested in how the university would support me." There's a modern university who said, "Well, we would try and assist, but actually in the modern workplace, we wouldn't want you to use this as an excuse, and we'd expect you to manage as best you can." And I'm like, this is the 21st century, you can't say that. But just this idea that still, you know, even when you advocate for your own needs by going, actually, this is how I'm different, it would really help me if. So I think, you know, the generation coming through are rightfully quite cross at having done a lot of work on themselves to identify their needs. They're then met with a wall where they go, oh, well, I'm not sure how we're going to work with that. Well, okay, let's have a conversation about that. Let's educate ourselves. Let's work together. Pretty sure we'll figure this out.
It's interesting that, you know, you're highlighting these points, and you know, this is what comes across as most important, you know, for people, you know, maybe the generation coming through or those who are not neurotypicals, let's say, whatever that may be. But you mentioned an important concept there, and the concept of money. And Robert and Elizabeth, I don't know if you got some thoughts around it then. So, you know, you know, we need money to live, but how important is money in that equation, and how well do you see the generation understanding money and you know, and it being a key factor in what they want in the workplace and what they prioritize within the workplace? Maybe Elizabeth. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is really fascinating, because a lot of the young people I speak to or work with now talk about values more than they talk about money. They want organizations that represent their values, and these are hugely important to them. What matters to them in terms of environmental impact and inclusivity and diversity within the workplace. These aren't just buzzwords. It's really tempting to think that this is just kind of newspeak, but actually this is what matters to individuals. And I was really inspired by the talk I listened to 2 weeks ago by Josh, talking about the kind of young people and the power of the consumer and what they choose to invest in and companies that they'll buy from. Yeah. You know, we would be foolish not to listen to this important aspect of their experience, because this is what matters to them. They do want organizations that think wider than the bottom line, because that's what gives them validity and that's what enriches their experience. It's not just about joining the bottom ranks and taking your paycheck home.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing that from our perspective. I mean, we work with more than 80 organizations for their early careers recruitment, and increasingly we're seeing from all of them that the people that, you know, that they want to attract into their organization are very much governed by the values that they see. And so what that means is that first of all, the you know, employers have to really think about their values and what their culture is, and how that's expressed. And things like the situation with Uber, where that kind of bro culture sort of picked up. People see that and it will put them off. And so it's that cultural and that values of what you express as a company increasingly important now. It also means then, you know, how do you express that in your recruitment process? And the story you gave, Elizabeth, about that dyslexia story, sadly, I still hear that. I mean, you think that's in any university. I still hear some of that in, you know, being expressed in interviews within, you know, large employers as well. And that's so important, is that is the first window that all that great talent that's out there will see about your organization. And if the recruitment process doesn't reflect the values that you've got as an organization, that you're marketing and you're expressing, then you're going to get the barriers go down very quickly and put off people that you actually want to be attracting.
And just to put you down on the spot a little bit, Robert, what do you think the most important values in a post-pandemic world then are likely to be?
Well, so this is where for me, there's a standout one, and I think that's where you've got the sort of Black Lives Matter that has kicked off really strong momentum now. And that whole point around diversity and gender diversity, but I think as well as around neurodiversity, that is now one of the key values. How inclusive are you in the way? And I, back to some of the points that Elizabeth was making. I mean, the conversations I have with my daughter now, just to educate me on inclusivity, and she's she used to feel so comfortable. This is a 23-year-old, but so comfortable in talking in a very sort of neurodiverse way. That is I think that's going to be the really important, the most important thing that people will look at when they go through that interview or recruitment process. Are you really genuinely inclusive? And they're very switched on and being able to understand the nuances around that.
Thank you, Robert. And Elizabeth, any final thoughts from you around that?
I mean, I would sum it up by saying, you know, when a young person approaches an organisation, they're testing them out as much as you're testing, you know, it's a two-way process. And what they're saying is, can you accept me, the total individualism that is me, or am I going to have to conform my me to fit your organisation? Because I think the younger generation have a much stronger sense of who their me is, who their identity is. They've got language, they've got understanding, they've got a whole collection of sense of who they are. And they don't want to have to compromise that to bring that to the workplace. It is not about the relentless pursuit in that way. They want authenticity. That's the word I'm grasping for. They want to be authentic, and they want to join a company that values people's individual authenticity.
And I think that topic of authenticity is one that has rung very loudly through all these forums that we've heard from different panelists and different speakers. So thank you very much for that. I'm aware that before we move the discussion on. Are there any? We've probably got time for one more question, if anyone has one for Elizabeth or indeed for Robert. Go on, take a risk.
Paul, I just saw there was an interesting question on that about, I think Caroline, that was saying, I saw an article recently that the government ceased to continue with unconscious bias training, so they felt it wasn't working. Any thoughts on that? And it came up yesterday with last week with the ex-chair of KPMG, who was also saying certainly more aggressively that unconscious bias was crap, which is a very poor choice of words. But it came back to unconscious bias training around that, and I think the training around it hasn't, and that's why it's very interesting talking to the likes of Elizabeth about understanding the psychology of people and how the brain works. And I don't think we've done a very good job around unconscious bias training. It's very much a problem that we need to deal with and think about. But my one take on that is that quite often we're a bit aggressive in and attacking in the way that we talk about unconscious bias. And it'd be interesting to get Elizabeth's point on this from a psychological point of view, that if you attack people on something, that their inherent response to it is going to be defensive. And I think when we're thinking about inclusivity and we're thinking about how we can improve things, we need to bring people along in the journey rather than trying to make them feel guilty. So
Elizabeth, we can bring you in on that quickly. You've got 30 seconds to come back on that, if that's okay.
I think that's completely right. When you challenge someone around their biases, it just heightens their defences, which is not a thinking space at all. In my experience, what we need to do is help people understand and feel comfortable with difference. It's about reducing anxiety. It's about increasing people's knowledge and understanding. It's about talking with. And much like Robert, my children have educated me enormously around this topic. So actually, the young people are the answer to our increased understanding.
Thank you ever so much. We've run out of time, and I'd like to thank you both very, very much. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. It's great to see all the questions and ideas coming through. Next week, I mentioned before, we've got Neil Fashi, who is a Team GB member at the minute, training for Tokyo, Paralympic cyclist, talking to you about achieving your potential in personal life and in your work life. Please join us for that. If you've liked what you've heard today, please get in contact with us. And you've heard so much. You've heard about authenticity, inclusivity, understanding that a year in a child's life is probably, a tenth or more of their lifetime, about containment, about being, if I use your analogy, Elizabeth, that big bucket to contain the sea of impacts frontal lobe neuroscience, which I'm sure you're all going to go back and look up now. You've heard a huge amount, and our ask to you is to put this into practice. And as ever, please keep the conversation going. We'll be posting a video of this on our website and also on YouTube as well. If I didn't get to your questions, I do apologise. But as I say, please do get in contact with us. Get in contact with Elizabeth and Richard as well, because it's been a fantastic discussion. So until next week, on behalf of all my colleagues here, I'd like to extend my best wishes to you all. Stay safe, be bold, be kind to each other, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much, everyone.